to the second episode of Doukhobors in Canada, Part 2. In this episode, we will describe a significant event, a mass pilgrimage that took place in Saskatchewan in 1902. Looking back to 1902, an extraordinary event occurred. A mass pilgrimage of approximately 2,000 Doukhobors set out to seek a promised land, a life based on their understanding of true Doukhobor values. We need to look into a few key influential factors. While still in exile, Peter Vasilievich Vergin had written letters to relatives and friends, as well as Lev Tolstoy and his followers. The letters were published in a book, Letters of Peter V. Vergin. One of the letters, describing how to acquire earthly paradise, was sent to Nikolai Izumchenko in 1896 in Russia. Apparently, these letters were not intended to reach the Doukhobors in Canada. However, in 1901, the Doukhobors received a book of these letters edited by Vladimir Bonch-Bruyevich, with an introduction by Vladimir and Anna Chertkov. The letters were read and discussed widely by the Doukhobors in Saskatchewan. The content of the letters created a wave of devotion amongst the more ardent Doukhobors and what they understood as their leader's intention for them as a whole. Following the details in the letters describing how to attain attunement with nature, they actively sought to manifest this utopia. But we must understand that this was not the only factor that influenced the pilgrimage. Certain Tolstoyans, including Bodyansky, Vladimir, and Anna Chertkov, had particular influence over the more zealous Doukhobors. They imposed their own views of extreme simplicity and freedom upon the Doukhobors. These influences, coupled with ongoing conflicts with the government and pressures to comply with the laws, all paved the way for the pilgrimage in 1902. It is easy to see how Peter Vergin's writings would have motivated the fervent actions of the Doukhobor pilgrims. A few key points demonstrate how powerful his words were in influencing them, especially as they were waiting for direction from their beloved leader.
In order to be true followers of Christ, it is chiefly necessary to go and preach the gospel of truth, and one may beg bread for the body. Remember that the apostles, passing through the field, plucked the ears of corn and ate. If any wish to labor, let them do so, but our duty is to labor only in Christ's service.
According to the letters, attaining an earthly paradise was based on preaching peace and goodwill. The letters also outline abstinence, eating that which grows naturally, such as fruit and even grass and roots, and living closer to the warmth of the sun, where one can do without clothing. Also refusing to utilize metal as it was produced oppressively in mines, returning money to the authorities, and not subjecting animals to work or use their meat for consumption or utilize leather. Peter the Lordly stated,
that man was created not for physical existence, but for spiritual.
Subsequently, in mid-October 1902, a group of Doukhobors went village to village, sharing what they understood to be the ideal path for the Doukhobors. Basically, not to forsake the spiritual in favor of the material, but going forth to attain an earthly paradise. In October of 1902, the pilgrimage grew to approximately 2,000 Doukhobors. It could be said they were moved by the same spirit of determined resolve to take a stand for peace as was done at the burning of the arms in Russia. The Doukhobor pilgrims prepared for their journey with firm devotion to what they understood as the essence of Doukhoborism. They set free their cattle and horses and did away with products made of leather, such as coats, harnesses, and footwear in ritual fires. They even gave away their money to the nearest authorities, rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. They discarded anything they thought might contaminate their spiritual integrity. These Doukhobor pilgrims became known as the Sons of Freedom, or Svobodniki, meaning free people. The Sons of Freedom Doukhobors had no intention of bringing something new into the Doukhobor movement. They simply wanted to carry on with their spiritual path, which aligned with Peter the Lordly's sentiments. They were witnessing the majority of Doukhobors becoming absorbed in material prosperity and were prepared to fearlessly take a stand for what they believed. This involved protecting the core values of Doukhoborism by resisting material gain and not utilizing animal labor and products. The Sons of Freedom Doukhobors departed in high spirits, singing psalms along the way. They ate raw vegetables and fruit and foraged for rose hips and cranberries. They accepted bread given to them by sympathetic Doukhobors and other settlers. They spent nights where they could, at times in welcoming villages or abandoned granaries, and even haystacks. The cold was ever increasing, and once they arrived in Yorkton on October 28th, they were in a weakened state. The women and children were detained by police. However, between 400 to 600 men continued the pilgrimage. The next day, the Doukhobors were barely out of town when the mounted police force attempted to stop the men by trying to trample them with their horses. The horses would not follow through. The police withdrew when it caught the attention of the local townspeople who protested the use of such tactics. On November 6th, the men reached Momentous on the border of Manitoba. From there, the police placed them on a train and they were returned to their villages. It was reported that the pilgrimage was peaceful. The Sons of Freedom Doukhobors took care of those that became ill or injured and functioned as a cohesive group. It is no surprise that from the participants in the pilgrimage emerged the first leaders of the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors. In particular was Ivan Ponomarov, a man of a serious nature, strong will and passion who led the pilgrimage with fortitude and endurance. In 1902, Tolstoy wrote to James Mavor, stating,
I cannot render judgment on them. While I would not have advised them to do what they have done, I nevertheless cannot help but admire their spiritually motivated self-denial.
In December of 1902, the Doukhobors' long-awaited leader Peter the Lordly arrived in Canada. After completing 3 5-year sentences, he was released from his exile in Siberia in the autumn of 1902 and told that he must leave for Canada. He was provided with financial support from the British mission in St. Petersburg to immigrate to Canada. He arrived in December, where his followers awaited him, including his mother Anastasia Vergin and sister Anna, where they were finally able to meet again and exchange warm and emotional embraces. Peter the Lordly was an impressive figure, much different than the typical Doukhobor that Canadians had thus far encountered. He was described by the Manitoba Free Press.
His voice is low and of a singular sweetness. Tall and strongly built, and of erect and graceful carriage, he would attract attention among hundreds of good-looking men. His hair and beard, which is luxuriant, are black as jet. His eyes are dark and thoughtful. His whole expression is that of a man who has suffered much and has triumphed over everything through the force of kingly courage and constancy.
Aware of the conflicts with the government and the upheaval amongst his people, Peter the Lordly toured the villages and met with the leaders of the Doukhobor colonies as well as with the Sons of Freedom. Everywhere he went, he was greeted with great joy. He sincerely thanked everyone for accomplishing great deeds for God, those that went on the pilgrimage as well as those that remained in their villages. He advised the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors to return to their homes peacefully and live as everyone else. A communal life of farming, cattle raising, and ethical use of animals. Most followed the counsel of their leader. According to historian Peter Maloff,
the result of the march was apparent to everyone. The main and most important result was the release of Peter Vasilievich Vergin from exile and his coming to Canada. While in Tambovka, Peter Vasilievich discussed the pilgrimage with Ivan Ponomarov, expressing to Ivan, "You understood me well and inspired our men to start on the march. By that you accomplished a great deed. As you see, I received my freedom and the pass to Canada because of your action. I am very thankful to you, Vanya, to all brothers and sisters who walked with you."
for some of the Sons of Freedom, returning to their villages and continuing life in an ordinary communal manner did not last long. In the spring of 1903, at least 50 Sons of Freedom marched to the village of Nadezhda. Many of them marched in the nude as a demonstration of simplicity and purity, resistance to man-made laws and losing one's cultural identity. Along the way, they were stopped by Doukhobor villagers and beat with willow twigs until they were covered in blood. The women and children were seized, but the men continued on. Soon after, the men were arrested and sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment. In prison, the Sons of Freedom endured all manner of horrendous conditions and torture at the hands of the authorities, and not all escaped death. A third and final pilgrimage on the Prairies occurred in 1907, involving 80 Sons of Freedom. Publicly walking in the nude resulted in charges of 6 months' jail sentences. It became commonplace for the Sons of Freedom to walk village to village, preaching and singing psalms, often in the nude. Their determination to spread the message of simplicity and freedom did not dissipate. In response to what they saw as growing materialism amongst the community Doukhobors, they flattened part of a wheat crop and soon after set fire to the cotton sack of a farm binder. As a result, out of the 10 men responsible, 6 were arrested and sentenced to 6 months in jail. 2 of the arrested men did not return alive. An elder, Nikolai Novokshynov, explained in 1975 that the Sons of Freedom were prompted to act by their deep faith and not out of selfish interests. He went on to share that
the Sons of Freedom considered themselves, in the spiritual sense, the elder brethren in the Doukhobor midst, and in this regard, they considered it their responsibility to guard the spiritual integrity of the Doukhobors as a whole.
the relationship between Peter the Lordly and the Sons of Freedom could be described as ambiguous at best. There are contrasting stories from the community Doukhobors as well as the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors regarding his alliance. Although there were times Peter the Lordly condemned the Sons of Freedom publicly for their actions and resistances, he also demonstrated support for them in a less public manner. There is no absolute clarity. No matter the position Peter the Lordly took, both the community Doukhobors and the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors were devoted to him. Meanwhile, substantial changes came into effect by 1906. Frank Oliver became the new government minister of the Interior, replacing the sympathetic and supportive Clifford Sifton. Once in power, Oliver began to take a hard line with the Doukhobors, giving them an ultimatum: either sign for their communal land under individual ownership, swear an oath of allegiance to the British monarch and become naturalized Canadian citizens, or the land they lived and worked on would be confiscated. They were to be held to the same criteria as any other settler. The communal Doukhobors and Sons of Freedom Doukhobors rejected these stipulations. In 1907, McDougall, the Commissioner of Investigations, cancelled a total of 2,503 Doukhobor land claims. In June, 258,880 acres were made available to the general public, resulting in a land rush never before seen on the Canadian prairies. The Doukhobors lost land, their efforts and effects. According to RCMP Inspector Christian Junget,
holding the mobs back was a nightmarish task. I have never experienced a meaner job than this.
It was evident to Peter the Lordly that the Doukhobors no longer had any great future on the prairies, and although there were attempts to seek refuge in other countries as well as Russia, all attempts were unsuccessful. Peter the Lordly had his sights set on British Columbia. In Episode 3, we will look at the exodus of the community Doukhobors from Saskatchewan to British Columbia.